Good day and welcome to this third in a series of videos for Lent 2021 on the Reformation as it happened in England. My name is Ross Hebb. The end of the last session, we learnt that Henry VIII died in 1847, and he died a committed old-style Catholic. He had initiated a jurisdictional break with Rome, and the Pope was no longer the head of the Church in England, the King was, but doctrinally, as far as the beliefs and practices of the Church in his kingdom or realm of England, Henry made sure that it remained within the Catholic fold of Western Europe. Today's session covers the reign of his son, Edward, who was only 9 years old when he became king in 1847. And Henry had set it up that a council would help Edward rule until he turned 16 years of age. And this council became dominated very quickly by the Duke of Somerset, and he ruled the council, and he was a reformer. And through a series of orders in council, he initiated a number of reforms in the English church. And at this time, during the reign of King Edward, the reforms were going to be much more extensive than they were at any time during Henry's reign. The things that would be reformed would be the practices of the church in England, the services in the Church of England, and through changing the services and the practices, the beliefs as they were understood of the church in England. And so Duke of Somerset set about to initiate these changes. And first they were imposed by orders in council. And there are two things that we need to understand about this point in history, and I guess about human nature generally, is that even though there was a sense of a need for reform in many circles, it wasn't a widespread sense. And reform had to be brought about from the top down, and Henry had set the preconditions whereby that could happen. But some of the things that were changed seemed to us to be unnecessary. But it was necessary to change both the practices as well as the services in order to get to the reform of the beliefs of the church in England. So under Somerset, some of the things that were changed were candles at the service of Candlemas on the 2nd of February. They were gone. Ashes and Ash Wednesday, they were outlawed, and also palms on Palm Sunday, they were outlawed. We may have difficulty understanding why, but because there were so many things associated with these practices, the message had to be sent that things were going to change, things had to be changed, and many superstitions had arisen in connection with some of these particular observances. Another thing which was done, which was very popular during the time of Edward and the time of Somerset, was that the clergy were allowed to marry. And many clergy in the English church took advantage of this opportunity, and they married the wives of the women that they had been secretly living with. Now, the other thing that took place during this time was the reform of services. And this happened first in 1549 with the issuing of a Book of Common Prayer. A Book of Common Prayer. And in that service book, the Mass was replaced with the communion service, and people were allowed to receive in both kinds, both the bread and the wine. There were to be only 2 candles on the altar and not a whole slew of candles, and there'd be no bells rung during the communion service at that time either. Now, as well as some of these practices, there was the interior of the church, which was also under attack or under reform. Paintings were removed, sculptures were removed, images were removed, clergy were no longer supposed to be wearing their elaborate vestments, and the church plate, much of the silver and the gold, was also confiscated and taken out of the churches. And so we see all sorts of changes taking place in the environment of the church, in the practices of the church, and the services of the church. Now, these things were very often not popular, and so the reformers had to assert, promote, and enforce these new things. And this was particularly the case with the new services. Clergy who would refuse to use the new Book of Common Prayer in 1549 were fined or imprisoned. And the Mass was out and the prayer book communion service was in. Now, before we think too many critical thoughts about this revolution in religion, we must think for a moment about the genius of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who is behind the Book of Common Prayer. The genius in the sense that he does not mark the prayer book with his own personality. He was not a genius in inventing it, but he was very much a genius in compiling the Book of Common Prayer. It was all in English, and rather than simply creating things anew out of the air or out of his own mind, he actually compiled services from what had already existed and what had already been in use in the Western Catholic Church and in the Church in England. The services of morning prayer were a combination of some earlier services that had been used in the monastery. The service of evening prayer was a combination of a few of those services and translated into English. And above all, he kept the prayer book Eucharistic Lectionary, that treasure of the Western Christian Church, the collects, epistles, and gospels that had been in use in the Western Church, all over the Western Church, for roughly 1,000 years by this point already. And rather than altering them all, he simply translated the collects into English and also used the English translation of the epistles and the gospels. Rather than being a revolution, this produced continuity, which were with what had gone before. Now, as for the actual structure and content of the prayer book communion service, I'll just mention that briefly to give you a sense of the 1549 Holy Communion service. And some of this is going to sound familiar too. For instance, the Glory be to God on high was in the first part of the service, as it is in many of the new liturgies, as opposed to its place after communion in the Book of Common Prayer, Canada 1962. But there was something else that was different, which we've lost for the most part. There was, in the middle of the service, before the consecration, lengthy exhortations. That is, the people of God were exhorted to prepare themselves spiritually for receiving of Holy Communion. Holy Communion wasn't something to be taken lightly. And we still find these exhortations, two of them, in the Canadian 1962 Book of Common Prayer. One of them at the base of page 88, and the other one on page 90 and 91 in the Book of Common Prayer. And these date from that day. They were in the middle of the service exhorting the people to prepare themselves before they received Holy Communion. And then, of course, in that prayer book, the Lord's Prayer came before people received Holy Communion, which is different than the prayer book structure, but also common in many parishes today. Then there came, after the consecration, the confession, the absolution, and the comfortable words, and then people received the communion. Now, these changes in services in the English nation, which had only experienced the Latin Mass for 1,000 years, were quite a shock. And there was, in the Cornwall part of the kingdom, an uprising against this, and that was suppressed by the government and the army. And because of this, Somerset, Duke of Somerset, was ushered out, and the Duke of Northumberland was in. And if people thought things were going to settle down or return to the previous status quo, they were sadly mistaken, because Northumberland was an impatient and much more radical reformer. In 1552, he had the Parliament pass a second Act of Uniformity. And notice the title of this act. It was like the first one in 1549, but this was a second Act of Uniformity. That is to say that people were going to have to conform and be unified in the use of the new service book. And if they didn't, there would be repercussions. For instance, if bishops did not show sufficient zeal or opposed it, they were put in jail. And think what would happen to the ordinary clergy who refused to use it. So the 1552 prayer book also included revisions of the communion service. And in this revision of the communion service, the structure is closer to what we find in the Canadian 1962 book. The Lord's Prayer comes after the consecration, as in the prayer book, and the Glory be to God on high is at the end of the service, just like in the present 1962 Book of Common Prayer. But as well as this imposing of the new prayer book, there was also more sacking of the churches. Statues were taken out, paintings were taken out. Anything that the more extreme reformers thought smacked of the old-style Roman Catholic faith of popery, as they were starting to refer to it, that was taken out. So there was a sense in which the worship space had to be purged of all the things that were there from before to introduce what is new. All the things that were associated with superstition in the radical reformers' perspective had to go so that the Bible-based faith could be introduced and enforced and imposed upon the English people. And that is where things stood. Now, before we're too critical about this legacy and the way in which things were done, we must remember that this was the introduction and basically has never been completely undone at all, although there was an attempt in the next reign during Mary. This has introduced what we now take absolutely for granted. All services in our churches will be in English, in the language that we can readily and easily understand. Not street language, not colloquial English, but in reverent English. All scripture read in church is in English, from an English Bible, an English translation. That was part of this reform. And also, the service is a set, known form. It is printed in a book for everyone to follow and for the clergy to use as it is printed. And it is a common form to allow for common prayer. And one of the great legacies of this prayer book tradition is that the services are participatory. There are portions of it which the people are to say, but the people are to follow and to understand and to use with their mind and their heart and their lips whenever possible to participate in the service. So it's a participatory sense and a participatory form of Christianity, this prayer book Anglicanism, which was introduced first to the English people during the reign of King Edward. Now, interestingly, all this came to a sudden termination on July the 6th, 1553, when King Edward, the sickly boy, finally passed away and died, and everything came to a full stop because, despite efforts to the contrary with Lady Jane Grey, Henry VIII's oldest daughter, Queen Mary Tudor, became the choice of the English nation and the new queen. And she was staunchly of the old faith. She was like her father. She was not like her half-brother Edward, and Mary would try her darndest to turn the clock back. But that's a story for another time, indeed for next week. Thank you for watching, and good day.